Racist cops assaulted a black man in front of his children, unaware that he worked for the U.S. government. Florida greeted them with hot, dense air and the hum of the sea surf, which seemed deliberately superimposed on the noise of inner fatigue. After 8 hours in the car, 2 cranky stops and a prolonged traffic jam at the resort exit, the West family finally made it to the Savannah Bay Palm Resort Hotel. It was the vacation they had waited 3 years for. Malcolm, a federal agency analyst, had spent the last few months living at the junction of nerves and access codes, while Rachel, his wife, was teaching law at the university and concurrently prosecuting a high-profile case defending lower-level employees in a Miami court. They had kids with them, 13-year-old Sarah, always staring at her tablet, and 8-year-old Noah, who could make a storm out of any subject in 5 minutes. They checked into a room overlooking the ocean, unpacked their bags, changed clothes, and in half an hour they were already walking down the whitewashed path leading to the beach. The resort was expensive, designed for those who not only wanted a vacation, but demanded that it look like a picture from an advertisement. Cocktails and pineapples, staff in light-colored uniforms, and a pool that you could walk into without getting your pride wet. Malcolm settled on a chaise lounge under an umbrella, took off his sunglasses, put his phone on the table and closed his eyes. He was here, not in the reports, not in the summaries, not in the numbers. Just in the sound of the surf, the laughter of children, and the tart smell of sunscreen. Rachel was sitting next to me in a light tunic, with a book she'd started reading in the spring. She didn't reread the paragraphs as she usually did, and she didn't look at her watch. Sarah was picking at the sand, making patterns, and Noah was splashing in the warm water, laughing at every wave as if he were seeing the sea for the first time. Everything was as it should be, and even better. If it weren't for the little things. A guard in dark glasses stood at the entrance to the beach area and looked at the family for a little longer than necessary. It seemed like a simple security check. But Malcolm, trained by years of observation, noticed rhythms and deviations. The waiter mistakenly brought the bill even though no one had ordered anything. Then he apologized, but he looked at it with a studied expression, as if he were checking Malcolm's face against something in his head. A few of the other guests, the couple on the left, the woman with the magazine by the pool, gave them occasional glances, not out of curiosity, but as if checking them against the background. Malcolm didn't react. He wasn't paranoid. Just used to reading scenes deeper than they appeared. He turned his head toward his son, noticed Noah dive in with delight, and covered his eyes again. Let it go. It's a vacation. It's a vacation. It's well-deserved. But random details continued to assemble into a picture. After about an hour, the manager approached them, a tan man in a white shirt, with a badge on his chest and a strange smile. He paused, looking at Sarah and Noah, then looked back at his parents. "We just want all the guests to feel safe," he said casually, then asked if everything was okay. The question was formal, but there was an undertone to it, as if he was trying to warn something but couldn't say it directly. Rachel thanked him and Malcolm nodded. But the phrase hung in the air like a scanning beam. Safety for whom? From whom? He put his glasses back on and didn't close his eyes again. About that time a noise came from the beach. By the deck chairs at the water's edge, an elderly woman was calling loudly for someone. Next to her stood a man, also aged, with an umbrella in one hand and nothing in the other, and that's what he was trying to explain to the guard who ran up to them. A bag was missing. Small, brightly colored, with papers in it. It had been standing here and now it wasn't. Malcolm said nothing, but noted that 10 seconds later one of the guards walked past them with a walkie-talkie, slowly, not hiding his gaze. Noah, unaware of anything, ran across the sand beside his father, waving his towel cheerfully. They were just walking towards the shower when the second guard began to slowly move in parallel, as if he wasn't following but had seen everything. Malcolm felt the temperature change inside him. Not on the outside, on the inside. It wasn't fear. It was more a feeling that something had already started. And now all he had to do was wait for the mask to come off this resort or be ripped off. The sun was slowly slipping toward sunset, enveloping Savannah Bay in a soft amber light. The West family was returning to their room, tired and a little weathered after a long day at the beach. Noah went on and on about how he'd outrun a wave, and caught a fish that got away. Sarah was silent, scrolling through the short snippets she'd accidentally captured on her tablet when there'd been a commotion at the water's edge over a missing bag. Malcolm walked last, occasionally looking back. He sensed they were being watched. They were almost to the door of their suite when a hotel employee, a young man in a dark green uniform with an embroidered logo and a naively friendly smile, came out of a side corridor. He apologized and, turning to Malcolm, informed him that there had been a slight confusion in the reservation system regarding the form of payment. He asked to go to the administration office, literally just for a couple of minutes. This is supposedly to confirm their details. Malcolm, without showing surprise, calmly agreed. He only glanced briefly at Rachel before doing so. Without words but clearly. As he left with the employee, Rachel took the card and opened the door. Noah immediately threw himself on the bed. Sarah silently settled by the window, turning on her tablet. Rachel went to the bathroom, but on the way, glancing out the window at the pool, she noticed two employees with a laundry cart approaching the area where they had just been sitting. One of them defiantly picked up their beach towel with tweezers and said something to the other. The other began to inspect the sunbed as if there was compromising material laid there. This was no ordinary cleaning. This was an inspection. Malcolm, meanwhile, entered the small staff office, where he was already being waited on. The manager, the same one who had approached them earlier at the pool, sat behind a glass desk, flanked by two guards now without smiles. One of them held a clipboard on the screen of which flashed armor forms and some internal reports. The manager rose, shook his hand, and began to speak politely but strained. He said that there was a mismatch in their system between the name on the reservation and the card used to pay for the room. He said it was a routine check. You know, we have misunderstandings. His voice sounded warm, but there was something clammy in that warmth, like the politeness of a waiter who'd already decided he wasn't going to tip. Malcolm listened silently and looked at the guards. One of them was no longer hiding his gaze, studying, even a little contemptuous. The atmosphere began to thicken, like the air before a storm. Everything seemed a formality, but there was an underlying threat in those formalities. Malcolm knew that kind of pressure, not direct, but viscous, dripping from above, as if you weren't being blamed but were waiting for you to slip up. He put his elbows on the table and simply said he could show the documents if it was really necessary. The manager nodded but suddenly stammered, "You see, we had a similar incident a couple weeks ago. Someone used someone else's credentials to get onto the property." He didn't finish, but the look was meaningful. At the same time, at the elevator, Sarah went out to buy water. While the machine hummed and thought about her dollar, an older man, wearing a brightly colored pineapple shirt and baseball cap, approached her. He squinted his eyes as if he recognized her. "I've seen you somewhere. You seem to be with the ones with the camera? Were you the ones filming when that bag went missing?" He spoke without aggression but with suspicion. Sarah recoiled, didn't answer, and walked back to the elevator. Meanwhile, in the office, Malcolm was already realizing that none of this was a bug in the system. Too many coincidences. Too many extra people in the room. And too many pauses between phrases, as if someone was waiting for a command on the earpiece. He pulled out his cell phone and dialed Rachel. He spoke calmly but with emphatic clarity. He said he'd be late and asked her to check the cameras, the ones on her tablet. Then he added, "And Rachel, turn on the tape. Anything that happens, write it down. Don't open it to anyone. Don't trust anyone." And hung up. He knew things were on a different trajectory now. The resort, the relaxation, the kids, all of that had been put on the back burner. It wasn't a vacation anymore. It's a script. And someone had already started writing it for them. The hallway leading to the administrative office was as cool and sterile as a hospital. Malcolm was standing at the window watching the sun set behind a line of palm trees, when two men appeared in the doorway. Policemen, polite, with faces that showed no anger, no haste, no interest. One of them introduced himself, though so quietly that the name was immediately lost in the air. They entered quietly as if they were there to check the meters. There were names on their badges, but Malcolm didn't pay attention to them. He was looking at their gestures, their gait, the position of their hands. The hotel manager immediately stepped aside, and the guards too instinctively drew back as if the power had shifted without announcement. One of the police officers said that there had been a report from a guest about the possible use of a fake card at check-in. And to avoid any misunderstandings, they should check the documents. Without further ado, Malcolm pulled out his wallet and produced his official ID card with hologram, stamps, security strip and photo. Then the regular driver's license. The policeman held the ID card for a long time, twirling it in his hands as if it might suddenly turn into something else. He leaned it against the clipboard, then the radio. Nothing was working. Or pretended not to work. The second policeman was talking quietly to someone on his headset, then stepped closer and asked, "Are you here with your family?" Malcolm nodded. He marked something in his notebook. It seemed that they were just following protocol. But the protocol suddenly ceased to be a procedure and became an occasion. At that time Sarah, standing in the doorway of the corridor, held her bag in front of her and as if unintentionally pressed one of the buttons on the zipper. The camera inside activated. She stared straight ahead of her, unblinking, unmoving, as if she had ceased to be a child. Malcolm noticed it and realized it. She understood everything. And it was both bitter and necessary. One of the officers looked at Malcolm and said that, according to department policy, he needed to proceed to the car for data clarification. He emphasized that Malcolm was not in custody. This is just a formality. But he cannot return to his family until the background check is complete. The formalities turned out to be a wall. At that moment, footsteps sounded in the corridor, quick, jerky. Rachel. She entered without asking permission and immediately addressed the officers, citing legal rules, articles, federal regulations that such actions without protocol were an abuse of authority. She spoke calmly, but her voice tingled with tension, like a string before a breakdown. The older officer listened to her and said slowly, almost curiously, "We have our own protocols, ma'am." He didn't argue, he simply stated that her knowledge meant nothing here. His face expressed neither fear nor respect, just indifference. He nodded to his partner and he opened the door to the street, where a patrol SUV was already parked with its headlights on. Sarah took a step forward. Her voice sounded unexpectedly loud. "I thought you said everyone was equal here," she said, looking at her father. Malcolm froze, unable to find an answer for a second. She was looking straight into his eyes like an adult, not a child. Noah, standing behind Rachel, began to sob. His small fingers were frantically clutching the edge of her dress. He didn't understand what was happening, but he felt it. Something was happening that even adults were afraid of. Malcolm leaned over, looked at his son, then at his daughter. Too much pain for one day. Too many looks. He turned back to the police officers, headed for the door himself. Didn't wait to be let out. He turned to Sarah and said quietly but clearly, "Write it all down, Sarah. Everything all the way through." Then stepped into the darkness beyond the door. Rachel pressed her lips together and didn't follow him. She stayed beside the children. Her gaze was fixed on her husband's departing back, but in her mind she was already unfolding a plan. She knew this wasn't a mistake. It was a system. And it had just started to show cracks. The air in the police station was stale and old, as if it hadn't been updated since the days when computers had been replaced by folders in iron cabinets. Malcolm sat in a windowless room, with a metal table that had been spilled cold coffee on it more than once. He was offered no water, no paperwork, no rights read to him. They just sat him down and said, "Wait, we're checking information." The air conditioner clicked on in the corner, but the air remained heavy. Voices could be heard through the wall, inaudible, but the gist of it was discernible. One of the officers, unaware that Malcolm understood more than he looked, said to another in a low voice, "Too smart. We should have him out of here for the rest of his shift. Or longer." The other one hummed, and the sound of his laughter was almost lazy. Meanwhile, Sarah sat in the hotel lobby on a low couch, with headphones in her ears and a face that expressed nothing. She was leaning over her tablet, but the screen wasn't a game, it was a video editor. She sliced snippets from the poolside guard's look, through the cops, "We have our own protocols" retort, to Noah's trembling hands and her father's phrase, "Write everything down, Sarah. Everything all the way through. No filters, no titles. Just silence and truth." A few minutes later, the video appeared on her TikTok account, where she usually posted dances and footage with her cat. The first likes appeared almost immediately, then comments, then reposts. Someone wrote, "Where did this happen?" Someone wrote, "Again?" Someone wrote, "Give me the officer's name." By lunchtime, 10,000 people were watching the video, and 2 hours later more than 500,000. Rachel was sitting in her room, with the phone to her ear, and her voice was supremely businesslike, but with a tinge that only came out of her in a courtroom. She was talking to someone she hadn't seen in almost 5 years. An old colleague from Washington, D.C., a former assistant federal prosecutor who now worked for the Office of Ethics and Internal Affairs. He knew Malcolm not just as an analyst, but as one of the key witnesses in a case that involved leaks and corrupt ties between law enforcement officials and local authorities in southern Florida counties. Malcolm was placed on a closed list under protective custody, but never asked for security for himself. Believed it was enough to keep a low profile. Now things had changed. Rachel uttered only one phrase, "They got him." Without a warrant. In front of the kids. In public. "He's at the station and they know who he is." After a brief pause, all that came out on the other end of the line was, "Got it. Stand by for a call. Soon." The call did come, not to the hotel room, but to the station where Malcolm was being held. The officer who had just chewed gum changed his face in a second as he handed the receiver to the officer in charge. He listened for a long moment without interrupting, then nodded even though it made no sense and hung up. No one said anything but tension hung in the air. After another 10 minutes, the door opened and the same officer who had earlier checked ID, with a smirk walked in and said with strained politeness, "Mr. West, sorry for the misunderstanding. It's all cleared up. You may be excused." His tone was wrapped in sugar but his eyes were blank. This was not an apologetic man. This was a man who had been caught by the hand and was now simply afraid. Waiting for Malcolm on the way out of the building was a man in a suit, not a police suit, not a hotel suit. Short, dark-skinned, with a quiet voice in which he could hear fatigue. He identified himself as a deputy district attorney and said simply, "Your family just opened a door we haven't been able to crack for years." He didn't smile, he didn't pretend. He spoke respectfully but without illusions. Malcolm's appearance, his status, the daughter's video, the public reaction, it all added up to a chain that could no longer be ignored. This was no longer a random incident at a resort. It had become a federal issue. Malcolm stepped outside where the heat was already abating. The air was dense but not as pressurized as it had been in the morning. He didn't feel free just out of his cell. But for the first time in days he had the feeling that the story had gotten a crack. Something had splintered. Not them. The system. When Malcolm got back to the hotel the heat was receding, but the air was still thick like the air before a tropical downpour. He walked with confidence, though his insides were still tingling not from fear, but from the tension that wouldn't let up. The hall greeted him differently than it had in the morning. Heads turned, conversations quieted, someone immediately pulled out a phone, someone stood up as if he wanted to approach but didn't dare. A few people glanced over and one of the men whispered to his companion, "That's him, with the video?" At the front desk stood the same manager who had spoken yesterday about security. His face was different now, not a trace of his former glossiness. He approached Malcolm quickly but tentatively, as if he were walking on ice that might crack under every step. He began by apologizing, talking about his deep regret, about the unforeseen situation, mentioned that the hotel was willing to reimburse all expenses, down to the airport shuttle and the gift certificate. Malcolm listened in silence and then, without rancor but firmly said, "We're not here for discounts." The manager froze, then backed off, realizing this scene would not end with a coupon for a free massage. The family reunited in the lobby. Sarah rushed to her father first, and for a second he saw not just relief but maturity in her eyes. She was no longer a child watching, she was participating. Rachel came over calmly and hugged him, but instead of words she handed him the phone. On the screen was a letter from the prosecutor's office with an attachment, a notice to launch a federal investigation. A few minutes later the hotel doors opened again. A group of about 10 people walked in, businesslike gait, precise rhythm. In the center was the county police chief, tall, gray-haired, with a face on which only expressions of control were used to be. Next to him is a woman with a DOJ badge and 2 journalists with cameras. One of them had already started filming. The police chief approached Malcolm, nodded demurely, and immediately took a step to the side, giving the DOJ representative the floor. She opened a folder, pulled out an official sheet and read out loudly, "Due to the release of video evidence of the unlawful detention of a federal witness, as well as reports of systematic misconduct within the county department, the Department of Justice announces the opening of a formal investigation of local law enforcement officials." The reporters took notes. The people in the lobby froze. Sarah stood next to her father, clutching the clipboard tightly in her hands. It was her video from the bag, the one with the officer's words, the face of fear in Noah's eyes, and her father's voice that had become the symbol of resistance, that had been the straw that broke through the wall. One of the reporters moved closer to ask a question, but Rachel stopped him with a look. There was no point in words today. Everything had already been said. In the video, in the footage, in the people's reactions. The police took a step back but the West family took a step forward. The next day they left the hotel. Not in a panic, not in a hurry. They walked out into the sunshine with suitcases and straight backs. There was a journey ahead, maybe to the courts, maybe to the airwaves, maybe just home. But they weren't coming back the way they'd come. Not victims, witnesses to change. In the car, Sarah sat at the window and edited a new video. Images flashed on the screen, the guard on the beach, the phrase, "We have our own protocols," dad in the hallway, mom with a straight back, brothers, sisters, passers-by. It was all part of one big story. She added the last words, sliced the sound, ran her finger over the timeline, and superimposed a black screen. In the silence at the very end, came what her father had said before he was led away, "Even if you're alone, write it down." The truth needs witnesses. Sarah pressed save. Then publish. And set the clipboard aside. Outside the window, palm trees slowly whizzed by. The car drove forward. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.